Hey guys, so this time we're going to paint a rose. And this is a white rose with red spots. So it has some reds, pink, purple-ish colors, and this is going to be our main object today. White in general might be a little harder to paint in watercolors because we are technically using the paper white as our medium, and also what I like to say is that there's no real white in true nature. All white flowers, white animals, they have a shade to it. So there's something that creates that white. So, and there's light that comes on the fur, or if we're talking about flowers, you will see some colors coming onto those white petals. So it creates like a shade of different colors. In this case, I think it's much easier to paint this rose because it has those purple colors in it, like spots, dots, whatever it is. So it makes it much easier to define those petals. This is a little list of all the brushes for this class. I started painting with the Heritage series by Princeton. I like their brushes. I like these brushes, and there's one Round 2 Snap. That's the Snap series. It's a different series. That brush is a little stiffer than the Heritage. So basically you just want to have a round brush, one smaller, one maybe larger, depends how you feel about the details and how large is going to be your rose. You want to have one rigger brush, and in this case Princeton calls these brushes liners or short liners. All other supplies, we have color swatches. I am painting with Holbein watercolors and tubes, and this is Saunders Waterford cold pressed watercolor paper, 300 pounds. So you don't have to paint on 300 pounds, you can paint on 140 pounds, which is a very common watercolor paper on the market. I prefer 300 pounds for a lot of reasons. One reason is because the paper doesn't buckle when you have a thicker paper, and also it can handle more, for sure, more water, more work. You can do more work on it, so the paper doesn't get damaged easily. First things first, I like to paint flowers wet on wet. Wet and wet means you're wetting the area first and then you're applying colors. So sometimes I fill the entire petal and sometimes I don't. I like to preserve some areas very white, like paper white. And it's important to really wet the area because I get a lot of questions, how do I do this that my area hasn't dried yet? Someone is following me and like, what do I do wrong? My paper has dried and you are at 6 minutes and your painting is still wet. Well, there's a lot of reasons. I keep working on the area a lot, so I keep going back and forth, and so the place keeps getting wet, gets paint and water, so it stays wet longer. But I also take my time wetting the area. It doesn't mean that I just load it with lots of water and I just let it sit there. It's just that I go over the areas multiple times. So I just make sure that the water gets in deep, and I keep watching the area. If it's already drying and I haven't even finished wetting it, then I need to continue adding the water, so I keep going over with the brush. And there's the yellow ochre. I'm starting with the yellow ochre. I do need to add one more color, which is cobalt blue. Cobalt blue is like a perfect shade of blue that I like to use for painting flowers. Like I said earlier, there is like no true white in nature, though everything has a shade to it when it comes down to white color. And what it is, it's like the cobalt blue creates that perfect shade, especially when it's mixed with yellow ochre, and you can just create a nice gray color, basically. Nice gray color. So if you mix on the side yellow ochre with cobalt blue, you'll see that nice gray color. So basically yellow ochre is like a yellow, and then you have cobalt blue like a blue, and those are the primary colors. Yellow and blue are primary colors, and when you connect primary colors like cobalt blue, yellow ochre, and red, you can really create different shades of gray. Now I'm going over the areas, and I didn't really wet the entire petal, just most of the areas. And now I'm just at first I added that gray color, and at this point most of the petal is wet. And what I'm doing is when I go around the edges, I do create in a way a hard edge on the outside of that petal, but whatever is on the inside of the petal will bleed towards the center. And this way it will mix with my water, whatever, if I have a water already in there, or maybe I already have the color, like in this case would be the yellow ochre mixed with cobalt blue. And then on top of that, so I already added that color on the edges, but then I'm adding the actual red color for the petals. So whatever I see in the reference photo, those red spots, I'm trying to follow along, and you don't have to paint these red spots in the exactly same areas. Like, you can be creative, you can just totally close your eyes and just put some spots here and there. It will still look pretty. So the idea for the flower for this rose, white rose with those red spots, is just to create that contrast and leave a lot of spots that are open, and so they are white. Now I am trying to leave some areas still white, paper white, and this is a different brush I'm using. I'm using the Snap series by Princeton and round 2. So that was a quick change of brushes. I just felt like I needed something a little stiffer. And stiffer is just easier to control, especially if you're working on the smaller areas. So I am literally like adding color on top of a color, but the most important thing is to know how much water you have on your brush and paint. Because if you carry too much, you can easily float the area and lose control. If you do things like in small amounts, you can really control what you're doing, and you can play with it. You just watch what happens, and okay, I just added this color here on top of that one, and now I'm creating a little more contrast. I'm adding those lines now. So it's nice that when you're painting wet on wet, all these lines are gonna be soft. So you're gonna get that soft effect, which is why I like to paint wet on wet, because you are getting that nice and smooth and soft effect versus painting wet on dry when you do have hard edges a lot of times, but you can get rid of them. But the idea is that it's not as soft. The effect is not as soft as when you paint wet on wet. The good thing about painting wet on dry is that you have more control. Now, I don't want to miss this moment to tell you what I'm doing here is I am lifting up. I am lifting up the petal. I am lifting it up to open up those kind of like the veiny areas. They're not really veiny areas, but I'm shaping the flower this way. I'm shaping the petal. So lifting up is really helpful, like when you want to achieve certain effects. So what happens is you add the paint, and once you have enough paint and you go over with that wet brush that you wiped before on a towel, and you go over that area, you open up and the lighter area, and you have this nice soft effect. This is a different brush I'm using now, a round 2 Heritage series by Princeton, and I am wetting another petal. So I needed a different brush, a softer brush to do this. I could have done it with my Snap brush round 2, but I just like the Heritage series in general. Generally, I noticed that I prefer, actually, over time, the softer brushes are my thing. I do like the stiffer brushes, and some of the really good ones are also by Escoda. You have Perla series and you have Barocco series. So these are Escoda's brushes, very good quality brushes, and they do have a nice pointy end and they are stiff. So if you don't have the Princeton brushes, and let's say you live in Europe where Escoda brushes are more accessible, I'd say get those. I would recommend them for sure. In the US, we have Princeton brushes, and that's an American company, and I think they're much cheaper here compared to the European brushes because of the import. So wet on wet, I am adding colors, and in this case I started with the yellow ochre, and I'm feeling it out, feeling the areas. I'm looking at the reference photo and trying to find the layers. So you start from light to dark, and that's the significant thing about painting with watercolors, is that you go from light to dark, not like with other mediums when you can just go from dark to light. The thing is that about watercolors, you want to use the paper white as your medium in a way, so you want to preserve the white areas, and then you also want to start with the lighter colors, lighter tones. And later, just like now, I am adding the red tones to accent more of those petals, and on top of that I'm also using the darker color of red on the edges, so that's more of a contrast. And I am painting this wet on wet because that helps that paint to spread nicely, and I get this effect, like soft effect, which I like a lot. And whenever I go around the edges, I know that the inside part is going to bleed towards the center, and if it's not bleeding yet because maybe that area already dried, then I'm just going to go from the inside with a wet brush and go next to that line from the inside. So here I'm just still adding the colors, and even the paint is not spreading as fast. I can always dip my brush in water, wipe it on a towel, and then go play with that paint. So with Holbein watercolors, the paint doesn't spread as fast as, let's say, with Schmincke watercolors that I started painting more now. These watercolors by Holbein are much easier to control. I think they're actually really good for beginners. I've been painting with Holbein for the last 2 years, over 2 years, and they're definitely something I'd recommend. I know that they are quite pricey in the US, but you can order them from Japan, like using eBay or Amazon. If you find Japanese sellers, these watercolors are much cheaper. So that's the thing. In the US, we have them a little more pricey. I believe it's because of the quality. It's like they're professional watercolors. And we have Daniel Smith, we have the Core watercolors, we have all these other American brands that price their watercolors so high. And then you have the Japanese brand, Holbein, which is excellent paints, and they're professional paints. So they can't like price them at student grade level at $4 or $5, which is probably what you would pay in Japan. They have to go on the same level with other companies in the US that price their professional grade watercolors. So that's my idea of what's happening, why Holbein is more expensive here versus in Japan. So I am lifting up here. I added all these colors. I added different shades of reds, and I need to lift up. I need to bring back light. It's not about really like bringing back the light. It's about achieving that soft effect. Because if I really wanted to conserve, if I really wanted to preserve that white, I would just start from this, like I would do this from the start. I would just avoid the areas to wet the areas. But anyway, so that's the thing. I'm wetting now the third petal. And if I really wanted to avoid some of the areas, which I might at some point, I would just go around and not wet the entire petal. And that's when you can preserve that white, the easiest way, the fastest way, the most beneficial way, I guess, because you have that white spot preserved for sure this way. So I'm going carefully. I don't want to touch the other petals, because if the petal to the left is still wet and I'm wetting now the right petal, then everything will start bleeding towards each other. Like the water will go towards the left petal, and that will create blooms because the left petal is already drying. And if you're adding water to the area that's already drying, like already you left it and it's drying, you will create a bloom. So blooms happen when you are trying to add more paint and or just a wet brush going over that area, and that area is drying. So I hope I made it clear enough. So like I said earlier, when I was wetting the first petal, which is the left one, I am taking my time wetting the area, and I'm using again the same colors, the gray color that I created by cobalt blue, yellow ochre, and then mostly now yellow ochre. and I'm finding the white darker areas, on my reference photo, looking at that petal that has some yellowish shade to it. And I'm starting from light to dark. So I'm going from the yellow ochre, and just finding these areas. And I don't put that paint everywhere. I don't go with my stroke. Like, I don't place that stroke everywhere. I am careful about that. And I can create some lines, and it's a perfect gray color, really, cobalt blue and yellow ochre for flowers like this, for the light colored flowers. And now a little bit of the darker tone, and going from the edge, because that's where my eyes focus. On the reference photo, this is where I see that darker shade of purple red. I need that on the edge, and when I'm going along the edge and the area inside is wet, I know that that edge is going to bleed towards the center. The petal is not wetted on the outside, so it's just the inside of the petal. If I wet it on the outside, then it would bleed towards the outside, but everything is bleeding towards the center right now, which is exactly what I want. And then the way I paint, my moves with the brush, it's like lines, almost like lines. So imagine as if you were drawing with a pencil or a crayon. You would be kind of going in spots, using the tip of that pencil. And that's what I do. I use the tip of my brush. I go very gently, very lightly on the surface. Sometimes it's like you're barely touching the paper, because you really want to be careful how you spread that paint when you're painting something fragile like this, because you're painting the white-ish petal. It has the red in it and stuff like that, but the idea is there. You want it to look fragile. So I am creating these lines at the same time. I'm just moving forward, and I don't have much water mixed in my color and my pigment that I pick up with my brush. And basically, when I go for the water, so I dip my brush in water, I wiped it first on a towel, and then I went for the color. I grabbed the color from my well, but the area that didn't have much water, so it's diluted with water, because watercolors have to be diluted with water. But I am careful about how much water I am grabbing. This is definitely a more concentrated paint now, and because of that, I'm gonna have that more concentrated paint on the flower, on the petal, so I can create more defined lines. If I had more water mixed with my paint, like way more water, and I brought it in onto the wet surface, everything would disperse much faster. It would just start floating. But because I'm using way less water with my paint, so the paint is more concentrated, I can control what I'm doing, and I can actually create lines while painting wet on wet, which is sometimes like, wait, how is that possible? You're painting on a wet surface. You can do that when you don't have that much water in your brush and mixed with your paint. Right now I'm lifting up again. Lifting up is like such a big part of what I'm doing. Like all my paintings, I always lift up. There's always parts that you lift up because you want to move that paint around. You want to see like the light. Where do I need that more light, that open area? And that's when you can just go with that wet brush and lift up the areas. I'm painting lines now. I'm creating the texture on the petal. It's like playing with it. See what I can do. Dipping my brush in water, wiping it on a towel, spreading what I already have. And at the same time, I am still lifting up. I'm opening up some areas. I'm finding that texture and looking at all the spots that I see in the rose petal. I'm trying to find all of that. And now I'm going to wet again another petal. Switching my brushes, getting the round 2 snap again, which is the stiffer brush, and it's a little smaller brush, so it's easier for me to get into the smaller areas, those little corners, those tiny little spots. So I don't go over or outside of the petal. I go on the inside. I use the tip of my brush to stay within the inside of that petal. If I use the whole body of that hair, then it's more likely I'll go outside of that petal, and I want to stay within that line because I need these petals to be separate, to be nice, nicely shaped. So I do take my time wetting this petal because I really want to make sure it's wetted. You will see me using my iPhone here a lot actually, because I was documenting for you step by step. So this is not something that I randomly did. I really planned on it because I wanted to show you close-up photos of what I do exactly. So I'm sorry if you see my phone here and there, but that's like the only way I can do this, and I could have just cut it out from the video, but then it wouldn't be fair because you wouldn't be seeing what I'm doing right now. You wouldn't see the cobalt blue mixed with yellow ochre. But this is another piece that you will see right next to this video class when I'm publishing it. You will see the step by step, and this is exactly the purpose of this, why you see me taking photos with my phone, because I need to show you close-ups of how much water I have, how much water I'm grabbing with my brush. So I am taking actually a photo right now, but I didn't want to make it so annoying for you. So I know that this could be like a little distracting, but it's not gonna be much. You see all these photos are gonna be right next to this post. It's just for you to see the close-ups, which I hope it will help you to understand better, like how much water and paint I have on my brush and how much of that I'm bringing onto the petal. So right now I am painting, but the way I'm also painting is there's a little part of that stem, so it's like a leaf that I am avoiding right now. So I'm painting that petal, the bottom petal, and I am avoiding that leaf, the stem, the part of that stem. And whenever I go close to that, the edges, I know that paint is going to be more concentrated, and it's just going to be like a hard edge, and I want that. I want that hard edge, and I want the paint to be more concentrated, because that area is more like in the shadow, like it will be darker. It's in the back. It's not up front, so it's not going to have as much light. It's going to be hidden almost. It's almost hidden, that petal, behind that stem with those leaves. So I added some of that gray color. I lifted it up again, and now I'm adding some of the browns. So this is my burnt sienna and Van Dyke brown, and these are actually different colors now that I'm adding, and just creating more of that shape of the rose petal, but adding an extra color. I love mixing colors. It's one of those things that is just so special about watercolors, the way they blend, and the fact that you're just using water is amazing. It makes it so nice, like so real, so natural to me. I just love it so much. So I'm not adding much water to this part. Like, I am very careful here. I'm using the tip of my brush. This is a very small brush, very tiny brush. It's not that tiny, I guess. It's around 2, but some series size 2 or 1 can be very small, while other companies make it very large. So it really depends. This one is kind of small. And with that darker tone, I'm going closer towards these edges where I have this stem, and I'm adding more concentrated paint, so there's less water in there. And I needed that to be more concentrated to create the contrast. And now I'm grabbing the round 4, and this is the Heritage series by Princeton. So I'm wetting the petal. I am wetting this petal, and I'm making sure it's wet. So I'm not trying to put like a pot of water at once. I am gradually adding water, and I go multiple times. I take my time. So I'm watching the paper. I have to see it, like where is it already wet. So this is the round 4 Heritage series by Princeton. So I keep wetting the paper, that petal. I need to make sure it's wet, and so the water is spread evenly. And I will go a few times because, first of all, this is a thicker watercolor paper. It's 300 pounds. So it can definitely handle more of that. But I also want that water to get really deep into the paper so it lasts longer. So I think that's one of the tricks that I use. And to answer your question, yes, I just take my time wetting the paper. That's why it's not drying as fast. And it also depends what size of a paper you're using, what you're painting. Of course, if I am painting a landscape wet on wet, it's going to be a little different. For sure, it's going to start drying in some areas, but then you have to use like a strategy, go with a strategy of maybe wetting some parts first and then working on those and then keep expanding the area. Right now I'm painting again wet on wet, and I'm just adding that gray color, which I achieved by mixing cobalt blue with yellow ochre. And I'm finding the lines that I want to accent. So by looking at my reference photo, I am finding these lines, and I'm finding all the darker spots of that white petal. So I continue mixing, and again, please keep an eye on how much water is actually mixed with my paint, and I'm grabbing really tiny amounts of paint. There's really not that much paint. It's very little amount. And this is definitely, you can see right away, wet on wet. Sometimes when you ask me, did I paint in my older videos, because you can definitely see that in my newer videos, or I'd say the last year and a half, I always say wet on wet or wet on dry. But one way to see if somebody's painting wet on wet or wet on dry, you will see if the paint disperses fast, like, or just disperses in general. Like right now, like you see it, like it's bleeding. So that's why you know for sure this is wet on wet. If the paint wasn't like moving, it was just a straight line, nothing is happening, that's wet on dry. I'm continuing painting right now wet on wet, and the paint is spreading nicely. It seems very diluted, and it's on a paler side, and I want that paler look, and I will add more concentrated paint as well, just to achieve some more contrast and vibrancy at the same time. But I don't want to go too crazy with the colors either, because this petal is white, and I still want to use my paper white as that white part of the flowers to bring more light in, to give more light. And then tiny bit of paint and just marking some spots on the petal, and the paint is still dispersing because it's wet on wet. My petal is still wet, and so I need to create some texture there. And even if it doesn't look as good yet, we can always move the paint around once we wet our brush. So we dip brush in the water and then wipe it well on a towel, and once you do that move, you will control everything better. So make sure you don't have much water in your brush. And I just want to make sure I have enough of that paint, and I just continue adding and spreading. And now I just dip my brush in water and wiped it on a towel, and now I play with what I have. And it's a lot of it is just watching what's happening on my paper. And based on that, I go like, okay, this is what I want to do next. It's just like I can't plan everything, especially with watercolors, because we're working with water, and technically it's very like hard to control it, but not really, because you can really learn, and it all depends on the amount of paint you're using and how much water you have. And you can paint definitely very realistically, like a real life objects, if you like that. And it's all actually about like creating the good colors, like mixing. If you can translate the colors well from reference photo to your painting, that's one thing, because when you do have that nice contrast between the light, shadows, and you pick all the colors right, it can be really realistic, and you can definitely paint realistic things with watercolors. I prefer the looser style overall, but I also like the detail, so I kind of combine both into one. So this is more of a realistic rose that I'm painting now, and it's all about watching, looking at your reference photo and thinking about everything, like how these colors come together, those layers. What layers do I see under layers? So this is another petal, and I'm just wetting. I'm wetting this petal, and I'm going very carefully. I don't want to wet my other ones, so I have to be careful and really go along that line. I barely touched the sides of these other two petals. I'm really careful here, just in case there's parts that are still wet, because if it was wet, it would bleed towards my new petal, those colors from the bottom two petals, and I don't want that. I want those two bottom petals to stay like separate. I want them to be like the way they are now, because they are defined already, and I like those hard edges on the top of those petals. So I really need to be careful here and take my time again with wetting the petal. So I'm just wetting, and now I'm adding the lightest tone, which I have the yellow ochre, and there's a tiny bit of cobalt blue as well, and just adding more darker tones closer to those edges where my bottom two petals are, just because there would be some sort of a shadow too in a way, and I am finding those lines and everything I see in the reference photos, so I'm trying to translate my reference photo into my painting. So I just kind of go along and looking at it, and it's okay if not that everything matches. It doesn't have to match, just the idea of it. You want the idea of it, so it all looks nice. And so there's areas that are a little drier. There's tiny little spots, so I went around, and I know that when I did that I would get the hard edge. So those little tiny spots, little circles, that's where I knew that I wanted to preserve some spots. It was hard to see it because it's such a tiny area, but if you really look closely in my photos of my work, you will notice those spots that they were untouched before, and then I went around, and then the hard edge created, but on the outside of those little spots the paint was bleeding towards the center, or the outside of it, I guess. So now I'm trying to define them even more by adding more concentrated paint, and I will show it to you in my pictures, so you can see the photos of this painting and you'll know what I mean. So it's important that you examine my paintings before you start painting along, so you see like the details, how it all works, like how the paint spread and what areas were preserved for white before. So for the stem, I'm just wetting it, and I have a couple different ways to paint the stem. I go with the way I would paint a branch, a tree branch, which I would first wet it, and then I would start with cobalt blue, and then let's say I would add burnt sienna or yellow ochre, and then maybe some red like quinacridone red or Van Dyke brown. So I use this technique a lot for painting my roses as well. Start with the blue, but it all depends because of like how do I see this stem in the reference photo, how blue it is or how green it is or how reddish it is. In this case, the color is very like grayish almost, so I felt like I need the blue to start with. I need it to be my first layer. So actually this is all one layer, but the first color, and then I go for my yellow ochre. So whatever I feel like I would need that yellow, I am adding that yellow on top of the blue, but it doesn't go everywhere. It doesn't go everywhere. And another thing to remember is that technically when you look at the color wheel and you have the blue, yellow, and red, so blue mixed with yellow would create a green. And generally, like when you look at the stem, it is a green stem. So that's why I went ahead with those primary colors first. And whenever I have sap green for anything I paint, like leaves or stamens or anything like that, I will add also indigo to my sap green to darken it up. So the area that's darker is going to be closer to that head of that rose, so closer to those leaves and stuff like that. And I'm going very slow, and I'm gradually adding the paint. I am moving the paint that I already have, adding more of that gray or initial gray color, which is a mix of yellow ochre with cobalt blue. And whenever I feel like I have too much already on my brush, I'll go back to my water jar, dip my brush in water, wipe it on a towel, and go for it again for that paint. It's all about the feel, like how much do I have? Do I need more? Do I need less? And it's basically playing with what you already have. So I added that paint stained my paper, watercolor paper. But now I need to lift it up and I'm shaping it. It's like you're sculpting something, almost like you have all that chunk and then you're removing a little bit, like sculpting it. That's how I feel like when I'm painting with watercolors a lot. I will add like a little more paint and then I'll start lifting it up and moving things around. So a very tiny amounts on my brush. Everything is really like under control, because when you have little, not much paint, and especially not much water in your brush, you definitely have more control. And then lifting up, bringing back a little bit of that light, but at the same time spreading the paint. And I'm really watching what happens, and then I'm like, okay, I need to lift up a little more and a little more, and then maybe more of that cobalt blue and yellow ochre on the edge, just to make it more, to add that little contrast. And I want to remember that in my head, like, okay, this bottom part or the top part needs to be darker. So the next thing, I can paint the next petal, because the neighboring petals are already dry, so nothing's gonna bleed. And when I'm wetting the petal, so I am just wetting it, the same thing, using the same brush, which is the Round 4 Heritage Series by Princeton. And I am just wetting it, making sure it's nice wet. I don't want the water to go outside of the edges. I'm using the tip of my brush to stay within the lines, and that's also important, to use the tip of your brush. You might want to practice too, if it's not something that comes easily to you, to use the tip of the brush. You want to, it's like almost like walking on your toes. That's how I like to think about it. So you don't want to walk sometimes with the heel. You want to walk like on your toes, like a ballerina or a dancer would be walking on toes. You want to think that way. Don't try to use the full brush, the hair. Not don't. I don't mean to say don't try or don't do it, because it depends what you're painting and depends how you're painting. Generally, that's just how I do it. I use the tip of my brush and I gently go over the areas. Sometimes I barely touch the paper. It's like almost like barely doing anything, but you are actually touching with the very tip of the brush. And then closer to the edges, I will create the hard edge. On the outside more, it's going to be a hard edge, but on the inside, the paint will bleed. And then I can move some of that paint and use that tip of the brush to spread it a little more and create some lines, then lift up, find the areas, open up some of the areas, move the paint around, dip my brush in water, wipe it on a towel, make sure the brush is wiped well on a towel when you do this, so you don't bring much or any actually water onto your petal, because you just want your brush to be wet. And then creating texture, some dots, spots, coloring, bringing more of those purples, reds, all the colors. Sometimes I just mix them all at once. Well, I don't really mix them. Most of the time I just mix the colors on my paper already. So that's a different way too, like you can do it, because a lot of people mix paints on the well, and then some people like me most of the time mix the colors already on the paper. So it depends what I do. But this is lifting up, just moving the paint around, and next petal. I am going for the next petal, even that I just finished painting the neighboring petal, because I'm not gonna go all the way to wet that petal. I'm gonna stop that line right before the petal that I just painted starts. So this way the water is not gonna bleed. It's not gonna bleed towards my towards my previously painted petal. And then just adding the color, the same grays, the same gray, shade of gray I created, which is the quinacridone, which is the cobalt blue and yellow ochre, and then adding some reds. And then adding reds and closer to the edge, or right where the other petal starts, I also want some contrast because that petal is hidden. That petal is a little more in the back. And then with a thicker amount of paint, so the paint is more concentrated, I am creating some spots. I'm adding some spots at the same time, and because I don't have much water in my brush, I can control the spreading, and I can also lift up if there is too much spreading. So it's important to sometimes pause for a minute, take a deep breath, and close your eyes and then just see it overall, so you don't miss something, because it's very easy to see something, like not notice what you're doing, in a way that sometimes, like, oh, I've been painting so close to this painting, like I haven't noticed even that one area is too dark, for example, or the other area doesn't have enough color, or something doesn't match. So it's important to even take a 5-minute break, or whenever you can walk away. Like, let's say if you're just painting these petals separately, you can just walk away, let it dry, and then come back. So round 2 brush snap series. This paper has dried and I came back to it. The whole thing dried, and now I am re-wetting the stem because I need it to be a little more colorful. I need to add more depth to it. And there's my, starting from the same colors, so starting with the cobalt blue, this is how I started. I started with a cobalt blue, and then there was sap green and so on. But first working with my cobalt blue, and then sap green mixed with indigo. And this is going to be darker because it's mixed already with indigo, so I need to keep that closer to under those underneath leaves, the leaves that are underneath that area, the center, basically where that rose is. And then creating the texture on the stem, adding lines, and then some of that purple. We have to remember those colors also reflect on the bottom, on the stem, from the petals. So we will have those colors as well. So this is the center, the rose hip. So we are just adding more colors, and we want some of that purple as well on our stem, which makes it look way more natural. And then small dots, mixing the colors. I haven't really used that much neutral tint, but sometimes I do, sometimes I use less and sometimes more. It just depends what it is. Most of the time to create the shadows or darken up the areas, and I need to way darken up this part, so I'm just adding a little more of the less water in the paint basically, and I know this way the areas are going to be more defined. Once it dries, the paint won't spread as much. Even I wetted previously this area, the stem, so I had to lift up a little bit because I felt like I needed to see a little more of that. And then painting the rest of that part, which is the leaf, and adding yellow ochre on top of my previously wetted area. And then a little more color towards the center, and then adding less. And then I'm going for sap green. So adding sap green, but I don't have that much water in there, so I can control the spreading, and my paint is more concentrated, so I don't have that much water, and that's what I needed. And then there's some of the Van Dyke brown also as well mixed in, and trying to define these more, so creating contrast and using just the tip of my brush, which is very important, the tip of the brush. And then more reds, adding more color, more contrast, just working the paper. This is not the first time I've been painting with this paper, which is Saunders Waterford 300 pounds cold pressed. I do like this paper. I've tried this before. I didn't like it on some things I was painting. Like, it was super hard for me to lift up when I was painting a dog. I was painting a French bulldog, I believe. It was a French bulldog. And I was showing actually on Patreon, I shared the comparison between painting the same bulldog on Arches cold press, I believe, or maybe that was a rough rough 300 pounds, versus painting on Saunders Waterford rough watercolor paper. So I was not able to lift up, and that was the thing. It was just about timing, because Saunders is not hard to lift up. It just depends what stage you're doing it at, and also it depends if you maybe overwork the area too much. Like overworked, what I mean is just played with the paint like I do here. It's not overworking, it's just adding paint, moving paint around and stuff like that. So I felt like the Saunders doesn't like that. This is where I am using the liner brush, and the petal is dry, but I'm kind of like dry brushing in a way, but I'm creating more texture. I'm adding depth to it. I'm shaping my petals and using that liner brush. The liner brush at the beginning might not be the easiest for you to use because it's a long hair brush. And sometimes when I'm focused on my painting, I don't switch to like a smaller brush. So you might see that in the video and thinking like, well, how am I supposed to do that? But the thing is that I just sometimes, I guess I'm lazy to switch the brushes. I don't know. I just continue painting with the brush like this, move the paint and stuff like that. The thing is, you just get used to it. Like, and I love liner brushes. Script liner brush, rigger brush, liner, short liner, however they want to call it. It's the same idea. The brush has a long and the hair is long and it's thin. So you can create those long, thin strokes. And I'm just adding more texture. I'm kind of dragging my brush too in a way, and adding more paint whenever I need. It definitely needs more color closer to that rose hip area, and it needs more of that color and contrast there, and then less of the color in general for the petals when they expand towards the end of those petals on the outside. If you want to, you actually can really make the top part like very wet on wet, and let's say just wet the top part right above the rose and then let the paint bleed. But you would have to do that from the beginning when you're starting to paint the 3 top petals, and just let it all bleed towards the top. It would be also pretty. I have done that before. I'm not sure when I posted that video, or it must be somewhere on Patreon, I'm not sure, but it's been a while since I've done it that way. So right now I'm just adding more color, more contrast, and I'm defining more of these darker areas and painting just lines and adding more texture. I want the texture, and that's the thing. This is like a second layer, and I'm just playing with it. I could have walked away at this point from this rose because it looks already good and I like it. I'm satisfied with it. But I want to continue adding more depth to it, and I just like the realistic feel sometimes. So it depends when I'm painting, what I'm painting, and some flowers are more loose that I'm painting and some are more detailed and some are just more realistic, like this one. I really wanted it to be more realistic because it's like straight on a white paper. I don't have any background, and so like if I cut it out of the paper, I could just hold it and in my head be like, oh, it looks like almost real. So that's just another thing. Depends how realistic you want it to paint, and so you can stop now or you can continue adding these little accents, like just play with it. But try to have very little amount on your brush because it's very easy to overdo, go too far. You just want a little bit. And if you do happen to add too many lines or too much texture, just go with the wet brush over it and start from the lighter areas and push that paint towards the center. So that's what I would do. So I just continue adding the color, the lines, more texture, and this is all dry already. All these petals are dry, and I'm just adding a little more, whatever I feel like I could add more. And I'm of course looking the entire time on my reference photo and I'm just deciding based on that. So now this is when I do want to actually soften up these petals. So I am softening them up. So I added all these lines, and basically this is just the same way I paint animals. I paint all the hair, hair everywhere, the hair, and then I go over it with a wet brush to give this soft effect. And then I do add paint. I add paint to the color as well, but a more paler wash. And then I just spread it with a wet brush. But I do wipe my brush before on a towel, because if I don't, then I have too much water in my brush. And it's really important. That's like the number one mistake that I see all the time with my students, is having way too much water on your brush. I guess it's water and paint, both. So that's once you get that, like once you realize that you need to just have less is better, then the whole thing is just changes for you, because you will know how to control better what you have on your paper when you have less. Because adding too much water can create the too much, it's just too much spreading. You don't get the nice effect. You lose your lines. You lose that definition of certain areas, and it's very easy to overflow your area with water. And the same thing, actually, the worst thing can happen is when you carry too much paint, and then everything it's just too much, and there's like almost no way out. Well, you can always lift up, but lifting up doesn't always work. So general rule is less is better. Well, I don't really want to tell you the rules, because I don't create rules for anyone. Everyone has their own rules. But if you think that way, that less is better, and you apply that to watercolors specifically here, then it will be much easier for you to paint flowers and everything else. The thing is that flowers used to like be my last thing that I wanted to paint. I really didn't like to paint flowers, and a lot of it comes with knowing how to, and then you start liking it. So that's the thing. Like, I didn't like to paint really flowers because I didn't know how to create that soft effect or paint them realistically. So I kept practicing and practicing and practicing and painting, and finally I got it. Like, I understood what I need to do and how to do it. There's different ways you can paint the flowers. You can do them wet on wet or wet on dry. Generally, I prefer wet on wet because it does give you that nice soft effect. Right now, I'm still working on the detail, and I'm adding those small little dots and spots on my flower, and this is the round 4 heritage series. And right now I needed a smaller brush, so this is my short liner 10/0 heritage series by Princeton. I just needed to create some smaller spots on my stem, so those little needles needle-like spots or dots, I needed to create small areas, and that brush is actually very good for that. I do like Heritage a lot more now than Velvet Touch series, and Velvet Touch series has been with me for a long time. The thing is that I had no clue, no idea that Princeton had Heritage series until I became their ambassador. I just became their ambassador. I guess not just, but it's been 3-4 months. Basically, I do use other brushes, as you noticed. I do use Escodas brushes. I do use silver brushes, and I'm still an ambassador for Princeton because I do like their brushes and I like them. I like the company. They're very nice, and they are okay with me using other brushes because they know I want to stay true to my students. I want to give a proper, correct review, and you will always know from me which brushes I don't like to use or I don't think they're good for me. And doesn't mean they're bad brushes, it's just not my thing. Like, Princeton has given me a lot of brushes to try, and I can tell you right now that Neptune is, for example, too soft for me. It's way too soft. I tried many times, and I'll probably continue trying. It's maybe just a matter of getting used to them, but generally they're way too soft for me. And one of my favorite brushes is Black Velvet series by Silver Brush. Their size 8 is just magical. But the thing is that for a lot of people, that brush is way too soft. And I totally understand that. I know it's way too soft for some people because you just have to learn how to use it. My favorite part about this brush is that it has a pointy end, and because of that pointy end, it's like having two brushes in one. And I didn't find anything similar to that brush. I just wish that brush was 100% natural, because it is half blue squirrel. And for those of you that do not like animal products, that's probably a no-go brush, and I totally understand that. So the alternative for that brush actually would be Aqua Elite Series brush by Princeton, Long Round 8. That's a very good alternative, although it's not as soft. It's much stiffer, but then again, if you don't like the brush to be too soft, then there you go. That would be the perfect alternative for you, that brush. So this is still final details and adding just final lines and small spots just to make it a little more realistic, some texture. And I'm using the same brush, which was the 10/0 Heritage Series by Princeton, and just final touches, small lines. If you're happy with your rose, then you don't need to do anything anymore. It's perfect, just leave it, and you don't need to add any more layers. I'm cleaning my brushes pretty well, and that's another thing. Once I'm done painting, I really clean them and I put them back in jars, because it's very easy to damage your brushes, and we all know that brushes are expensive. They're not cheap, especially the larger ones or the natural brushes, although I'm not a fan of the 100% natural brushes, because I don't even think to me, they're not that useful as the half synthetic, half natural, or synthetic, 100% synthetic, which I prefer much more. So I'm just wetting the areas that I originally marked for myself, and I'm just softening everything up. I just want these petals to look soft and small dots, and because I wetted that area, and now I'm adding those dots, they will spread and they will be soft. They won't be as defined. So that's the thing. I just need to add a little more spots, more texture on my petals, just to make it a little more like my rose in the photograph. So if you ever in the Santa Monica area, there's that rose garden in Palisades Park. It's on Palisades Street, and that's my favorite place to take photos of roses, and you get inspired immediately. There's so many beautiful roses and petals.